video, I will be discussing an analysis specifically on the topic of fear. Now, out of fear, we as humans have two or more responses we may experience going forward, and you find that in the epinephrine system. Based on fear, you would feel your epinephrine, also known as your adrenaline, kick in. Upon the entryway of adrenaline, you would experience two or more particular pathways which stem and are as a result of the stance of guilt and fear once again. And the three choices you get of fight, flight, or freeze, in the adrenaline response, you would then see the emotional and logical intelligence have a play in which particular system of the epinephrine response the individual then further pursues forward, based on the intelligence of the two initial intelligence between between logical and emotional intelligence. Now, what might an in-depth analysis at fear look like? Well, in order to do so, I'm going to tell you a true story in order for you to understand what a deeper dive into a analysis at fear looks like. So as an example, when I was around the age of 5.5, 6, I was playing with my father's fully grown male Doberman. And in playing with the Doberman, which is a very big dog, in playing with the Doberman, I ended up causing it to experience frustration or a pain of sorts. I was a pain in its ass in the way I was playing with it. But going forward, what ended up happening is the Doberman then, out of panic and fear or anger, the Doberman then stood up and attacked me, which it grabbed the head of myself into its mouth and began thrashing its jaws, which as a result, I now have a lot of lines and scars on the side of my head where the Doberman specifically thrashed my skin apart on my head. Now, I never received any particular surgery to fix it, but in the going forward aspect of things, beyond the initial onset of the particular trauma of the dog attack in that particular statement, to this day, I'm not afraid of dogs. You can have as big of a dog as you want. I'm not afraid of it. Now, why might that be? Let's dive into the fear aspect of the analysis. If I reacted on an emotional basis of intelligence or an emotional stance, I would have forever gained a fear out for the dog, which means that any dog now, I would experience that trauma flashback. Anytime I would encounter a dog, then I would experience a feeling of fear based on the initial trauma. In the logical stance, where you then process of the experience from a logical intelligence perspective, I realized I hurt the dog out of its anger and pain. It ended up lashing out, resulting in me experiencing pain. And because of this, I now bear the scars. In terms of the actual fear, if I respond from an emotional standpoint, I act in an unstable way. Whereas if I act from a logical perspective, I act in a controlled manner in my response. Which, in my controlled manner of the response, it doesn't matter the size of the dog or how many there are. A dog just does not scare me anymore because I have felt the strength of the aggression of the dog, which places the important statement around fear. Unless if you can bypass the, you could say, comfort zone, that which is the fear holding you back, unless if you can pass the fear that is holding you back in your comfort zone, you do not develop as an individual. As in an analysis that Dr. Jordan Peterson placed as an example, he found that when you look at the development of lobsters, you would see them go through transformational stages. And then the idea of the lobster was specifically to study how their interaction in themselves, based on their social structure, how they have built, in essence, a hierarchy, which we have been told a pyramidical structure hierarchy is a societal construct. Yet we see this particular pattern within other life forces, other life sources, animals, mammals, sea life, on and on and on and on. And based on the fear analysis, we then dive into the anxiety analysis, which now, based on an initial trauma that created an emotional fear response, you would then create what is known as anxiety. And anxiety, in the beginning parts of anxiety, is a form of a PTSD. It creates anxiety. The stimulus of a similar experience of the trauma results in now you experiencing the initial moment or feeling of the onset trauma, which creates a trigger point. Going into the analysis of anxiety, one would see that the beginning aspects of anxiety in itself is a spectrum of the beginning of what is known as schizophrenia. Anxiety is the early stage spectrum of the same thing. It is simply just at how fully blown does the spectrum increase. Well, let's see, beyond schizophrenia, you then enter the next evolution of that mental condition, which is dementia. And as the deterioration of the nucleation of the gray matter overcomes or overtakes the structure of white matter within the brain, which as a result creates a nucleation point, which gray matter generation creates a hollowing of the structure of the brain, hence why it is called gray matter. But now the further the progression of gray matter development within the mental condition of the individual, you would then begin to see that in the development of further and further, more and more gray matter, you would then begin a deterioration of the structure of the brain, where in its center core, the experience of dementia often arises around aggression, which is when you are no longer able to recenter in your current state. Within this level of aggression is, as a result, you could say, a pathology of the mind, and we can see the pathology of the mind develop the further we dive into mental conditions. So for example, you begin at anxiety, which is the prime or first onset experience of echolocation at its mildest form. And at its mildest form, echolocation stimulates either an emotional or intelligent or logical response to its stimulus, which the more you engage, not in just the physical development, but in the mental development, such as training your mind through certain practices. Some of them can be such as reading, meditating, playing or singing, playing musical instruments, painting, any type of art, things that inquire you to create a perspective, a representation of a thing you're simply trying to express. And in the expression of the self, we find the further development. So you could say from telepath or beginning portion of echolocation, you then see anxiety. From schizophrenia, you then enter a sociopathic nature, where you are no longer as easily malleable or as easily integratable within society. You stick out like a sore thumb. And then you enter things like dementia, where you become more demented in your psychopathy or psychopathy. And in the next stage, you further and further and further degenerate in the mental state, because the more divine an experience is, the more essentially reverse the individual experience will be. In the instability of experiencing divinity, how would you feel if all of a sudden you experienced divinity for the first time? If you're not accustomed or creating a logical understanding or intelligence based on your experience, you would then see the emotional intelligence resulting in the instability. And so what is the fear of Western civilization? The mind. Now, in the first early stage of the video, I began talking about the initial diagnosis or analysis of fear, which in my sharing of the story, I dive into a story of mine, and I dive further and further and further and further into the analysis of the root of fear. Notice as the video progresses, I maintain asking myself questions regarding fear. What are its origins? What are its natures? What are its impacting factors? On and on and on, until you get to a more dissected way. In the same way surgery can dissect the body, psychology in psychoanalysis can dissect the mind. You can actively create openings where you can peer inside the mental system, the mental networks, and how they wire themselves based on how you see each little pattern of the individual in their train of thought. You can see the replication of the pattern based around the initial trauma, the initial fear. And in the logical intelligence, or the explanation of things, the more you analyze the fear of the individual, the more logical it becomes. And the more logical it becomes, the more easily you can understand why they have now an emotional response to said onset of trauma or fear. And now the arising of the different complexes of the mind, such as mental conditions or mental distress disorders that arise as a result of the emotional intelligence, the emotional structure of the brain having been overdeveloped. And so, in the process of fear, in the disciplinary act of the initial trauma, you could either say it is a discipline or a trauma. It is simply the onset at which you're creating the initial fork at which the developing individual must now create its own response that then stimulates the regions of the brain they will then further develop into their own self as a personality. The onset of fear requires the hero to overcome it. And in the idea of overcoming fear, you must slay the dragon of chaos. And what is the dragon of chaos? In Jordan Peterson's analysis, the dragon of chaos is specifically that which you are not aware of, the unknown. And so back into the analysis of the story I told you, if it were a human that had done that particular incident to myself, the level of response would have been different. And you might say yes, because it's a human compared to an animal. But the physical damage would have stayed the same. So what separates a human from an animal? To which you would now answer its level of self-awareness, its level of consciousness. But in the understanding that if I may forgive an animal based on its level of consciousness because it is simply not aware of its patterns, now analyze this perspective when you are dealt a trauma from a person. A traumatic experience or a negative individual spreading or specifically dispersing guilt or fear from within themselves and dispersing it to the world, so that the world may experience it themselves, because they themselves as an individual cannot hold on to said fear and guilt. You then see the reflection of their behavior in their own personality, which emotional or logical response they are having to their own trauma. An emotional response would be to repeat and become a repeat offender, whereas a logical perspective would be to say, I can see why this occurred. And from the pattern analysis, you then see where you can give a forgiveness. I forgave the dog that did that to me. Why? Because in the end, I was just a stupid kid. And in jumping around the dog, I accidentally landed on its ribcage while it was laying down, which resulted in the dog all of a sudden jumping up in pain and in a moment of pain/anger towards a young adult or a young human boy. The dog essentially freaked out, which then it mauled the shit out of me. And I still have the scars all over my head in terms of fine lines. Now, the logical perspective is to forgive. The emotional perspective is specifically to repeat. And so when we see individuals that have experienced a trauma and they begin a repetitive pattern of said trauma, where in order to seek or gain control over that particular trauma, they then replicate the same trauma and place it upon an innocent, an act of taking control over said fear, which in itself is a complex. It is a beginning portion of narcissism, which now when you look further into the analysis, you would begin to see that narcissism and empathy stem from emotional and logical intelligence. If I stimulate too much emotional intelligence, that creates too much pain, resulting in now the development of narcissistic tendencies to control the environment in order to reduce the onset of levels of pain you may experience from the stimulus of the environment. Whereas if you increase the level of logical thinking, you enter a more understanding perspective and you become a more empathetic person. But as stated in a video, we also see that there is the rise of now empathetic narcissists which seek to control the environment around them, not to protect themselves from experiencing pain, but to control others from experiencing pain, that which the narcissist knows this particular road would surely lead to. And then you see the rise of narcissistic empaths, also known as neurotics. Neurotic people, which is a jealousy. And because I can't have that, I'm going to control the rest of the world so that they may not have that either. Out of the initial 2 personalities, you see then 4. And these four specific personalities arise based on the stimulus of either trauma or discipline, creating a nucleation point within either the emotional or logical intelligence of the brain, whether it be prefrontal or peripheral cortexes. You then see that according to how the individual first reacts in the first initial trauma or act of discipline, you will see where they first develop their true strength, whether it be emotional or logical. Thank you.